My husband walked through the front door at 12:47 a.m., looked me straight in the eyes, smiled as if nothing had happened and said, "I don't owe you an explanation." Those 7 words ended a marriage that had taken 43 years to build, though neither of us admitted it that night. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't ask another question. I simply looked at him, nodded once, and stepped aside so he could walk past me. He seemed almost surprised that I wasn't arguing, but I had already learned something about silence. Sometimes it revealed more than anger ever could. Victor placed his keys into the small ceramic bowl by the entryway, removed his jacket with the same calm routine he had followed for decades, and headed toward the kitchen as though coming home after midnight required no explanation at all. I remained standing in the hallway, listening to the familiar sounds of cabinet doors opening, ice cubes dropping into a glass, and the refrigerator closing softly. The house itself seemed to be holding its breath. It was early October, and the cool Pennsylvania air slipped through the tiny gap beneath the front door. Outside, the maple trees lining our street rustled gently beneath the streetlights, their leaves beginning to glow with the warm colors of fall. Inside, everything still looked exactly the way I had arranged it earlier that evening. The dinner plates had long since been cleared away. The small candle on the dining table had burned almost to the bottom of its glass container. His favorite beef stew still sat untouched in the slow cooker, kept warm far longer than any meal should have been. I had checked the clock more times than I cared to admit. At 9, I assumed he had been delayed. At 10, I convinced myself traffic must have been unusually heavy. By 11, I stopped inventing excuses for him. At midnight, I stopped calling his phone because every unanswered ring felt like another quiet insult. When he finally appeared, there wasn't a trace of panic on his face, only that calm smile I no longer recognized. There had been a time when Victor would have called if he were even 15 minutes late. There had been a time when he would have apologized before I ever asked a question. We had spent decades building habits together, small promises that made an ordinary marriage feel safe. Somewhere along the way, those promises had quietly disappeared, replaced by locked phone screens, unfinished conversations, unexpected business dinners after retirement, and nights that stretched longer with each passing month. I had noticed every change, though I rarely mentioned them. A different cologne, new dress shirts I hadn't seen before, credit card charges from restaurants we had never visited together, smiles that ended the moment I entered the room. Each detail seemed harmless on its own, but together they formed a picture I could no longer ignore. Still, nothing prepared me for hearing my own husband tell me he owed me nothing. He carried his glass into the living room and settled into his favorite recliner, switching on the television without really watching it. The soft glow filled the room while I quietly collected his untouched dinner bowl from the kitchen counter. I placed it into the refrigerator instead of throwing it away. My hands never shook. My breathing stayed steady. That surprised even me. I wasn't calm because I trusted him. I was calm because something inside me had shifted. Whatever answers I had hoped to hear were no longer going to come from his mouth. If the truth still existed, I would have to find it somewhere else. That night, while Victor eventually drifted off to sleep in his chair with the television murmuring quietly in the background, I sat alone at the dining table, staring at the candle that had finally gone dark. For the first time in 43 years of marriage, I stopped waiting for my husband to explain himself. Instead, I began preparing to uncover every answer he never intended to give. The next morning arrived with the quiet certainty that life would continue whether I was ready for it or not. Sunlight filtered through the kitchen window and settled across the oak table where Victor and I had shared thousands of breakfasts over 4 decades. I prepared coffee the same way I always had, measuring the grounds carefully, waiting for the familiar aroma to fill the room, setting out 2 mugs without thinking before quietly returning one to the cabinet. Old habits do not disappear overnight. They simply linger, hoping for a version of yesterday that no longer exists. Victor came downstairs dressed for another day that supposedly required endless errands, wearing a crisp blue button-down shirt I had never seen before. He greeted me with an easy smile, poured himself coffee, and asked whether we needed anything from the grocery store. His voice was relaxed, almost cheerful, as though the distance between us had become completely ordinary. I looked at him for a moment and realized something unsettling. He genuinely believed the conversation from the previous night was over. In his mind, refusing to explain himself had solved the problem rather than created one. I answered that we had everything we needed. He nodded, glanced briefly at his phone when it vibrated on the counter, and turned the screen away before slipping it into his pocket. It was a small movement, almost invisible, but I noticed it because I had started noticing everything. After he left, I stood alone in the driveway until his car disappeared around the corner. For years I would have spent the rest of the morning wondering where he had gone and inventing comforting explanations to protect my own peace. That morning I chose something different. I walked back inside, opened the hall closet, and found the old cardboard box where we kept household records that no one had touched in years. Mortgage statements, insurance policies, tax returns, utility bills, warranty papers for appliances we no longer owned. Organizing paperwork had always been my responsibility, and I suddenly realized that responsibility had quietly given me a clearer picture of our life than Victor probably understood. I carried the box to the dining table and began sorting every document by year. Nothing dramatic appeared at first. Most of it reflected the ordinary rhythm of a middle-class American family that had worked hard, paid its bills, and planned carefully for retirement. Yet as the hours passed, subtle differences emerged. There were transfers between accounts that I did not remember discussing. Investment statements that listed balances lower than I expected. Insurance correspondence addressed only to Victor. None of it proved wrongdoing, but together the details felt strangely incomplete, like pages missing from a familiar book. Around lunchtime, Grace Whitmore called to ask whether I wanted to meet for coffee later that week. Grace and I had been friends since our children were in elementary school. She immediately sensed something unusual in my voice, but I simply told her I had been thinking about organizing old family records. She laughed softly and said retirement seemed to inspire everyone to clean closets and file cabinets. After we hung up, I smiled for the first time all day. It reminded me that not every relationship in my life had become difficult. Some people still spoke with kindness because kindness was simply part of who they were. Late that afternoon, Victor returned carrying 2 shopping bags and a bakery box filled with my favorite lemon pastries. Years ago, that thoughtful gesture would have erased every doubt in my mind. Now it felt strangely out of place, almost rehearsed, as though generosity had become another routine instead of an expression of affection. During dinner he chatted about the weather, a neighbor replacing his roof, and the football game coming up that weekend. He never mentioned where he had actually spent the previous night. I never asked. Every unanswered question settled quietly between us, heavier than any argument could have been. Before going to bed, I carefully placed the newly organized folders into a small file cabinet beside my desk. As I turned off the lamp, one thought stayed with me more clearly than any other. Trust had not disappeared all at once. It had faded one ordinary day at a time, hidden inside small moments that seemed too insignificant to challenge until they finally formed a truth too large to ignore. Over the next several days I settled into a routine that looked almost identical to the life I had lived for years, but everything felt different because I was paying attention instead of making excuses. Victor continued leaving the house after breakfast with vague explanations that sounded reasonable on the surface. Some mornings he said he was meeting an old coworker. Other days he mentioned stopping by the hardware store or helping a retired neighbor with a small project. His stories were ordinary enough that anyone hearing them once would probably accept them without a second thought. The problem was that I had heard too many versions of the same ordinary story, and they no longer fit together. One Tuesday afternoon I decided to organize the laundry room cabinets, something I had postponed for months. While moving a stack of folded blankets from the shelf above the utility sink, I noticed a small paper shopping bag tucked behind an old toolbox. It was not hidden carefully, only forgotten. Inside was a receipt from an upscale men's clothing store located nearly 60 miles from our neighborhood. The purchase had been made on a Thursday morning 3 weeks earlier. According to Victor, he had spent that entire day helping a friend repair a backyard fence less than 10 minutes from our house. I studied the receipt for several seconds before placing it exactly where I had found it. I did not need confrontation. I needed patterns. Later that evening, while Victor watched the local news, his cell phone buzzed twice on the coffee table. He had stepped into the garage to bring in a package that had been delivered that afternoon. I had no intention of touching his phone, but I noticed the screen briefly illuminate before it went dark again. There was no name, only a notification that disappeared too quickly to read. Even so, his reaction when he returned told me more than the message itself. Before removing his jacket, before asking whether dinner was ready, before saying another word, he reached for the phone and slipped it into his pocket. It was instinctive, almost automatic. Years ago he would have left it lying on the table all evening. After dinner he announced that he needed to attend a community association meeting the following night. I smiled politely and wished him a productive evening. He looked at me for a moment, almost as if he expected another question, but none came. The silence had begun to make him uncomfortable. I could see it in the way he occasionally searched my face, waiting for an argument that never arrived. On Thursday I finally met Grace for coffee at the small family-owned cafe where we had celebrated birthdays, retirements, and countless ordinary afternoons over the years. She listened as I spoke about everything except the one subject occupying my thoughts. We discussed gardening, rising grocery prices, and her granddaughter's first semester of college. Then, just as we stood to leave, she hesitated. Her expression softened with concern. She asked whether everything was truly all right at home because she had seen Victor several times recently across town during hours he claimed to be busy elsewhere. She emphasized that he had never been alone long enough for her to draw conclusions, but she admitted the repeated coincidence had begun to seem unusual. I thanked her for telling me without asking another question. Driving home, I realized the quiet uneasiness I had carried for months was no longer built only on intuition. Small pieces from different places were beginning to connect. By the time I pulled into my driveway, I understood something important. The truth was not going to arrive through one dramatic discovery. It was revealing itself one ordinary detail at a time, and I intended to notice every single one. When I arrived home that afternoon, I carried my purse into the study instead of setting it by the front door as I usually did. The small file cabinet beside my desk suddenly felt more important than any piece of furniture in the house. For years it had quietly collected the ordinary paperwork of our lives, documents that seemed dull until I realized they were capable of telling stories no one intended to share. I opened the top drawer and continued organizing every statement, receipt, and policy into neat folders. As I compared records from the past 3 years, another subtle change emerged. Several automatic transfers had begun shortly after Victor retired. The amounts were never large enough to attract immediate attention. $200 one month, $350 the next, sometimes $500. Spread across many months, they blended into the background of everyday expenses. But when I totaled them with a calculator, the number surprised me. It was several $1,000s that I could not connect to any purchase we had ever discussed. I searched for matching invoices, renovation contracts, charitable donations, or family gifts. There were none. The money had simply moved somewhere else. That discovery unsettled me more than I wanted to admit. Victor had always insisted that financial decisions should be made together. We had built our retirement on careful planning, long conversations around the kitchen table, and mutual trust. I remembered winter evenings years earlier when we spread investment reports across the dining room, laughing about how exciting retirement would be if we remained disciplined. We promised each other there would never be financial secrets between us. Looking down at those statements, I wondered when that promise had quietly disappeared. The following morning I visited our local bank under the simple excuse of updating some account information. The young customer service representative greeted me warmly and helped me review the accounts that were jointly registered in both our names. Everything appeared normal at first glance. Balances matched my records, recent deposits looked familiar, and routine household payments had cleared exactly as expected. Yet while printing a transaction summary, she casually mentioned that some investment correspondence had recently been redirected to a different mailing preference selected by the primary account holder. The comment sounded harmless, and she immediately apologized for mentioning something that required no action from me. I smiled politely and thanked her for the information, but her words stayed with me throughout the drive home. Victor had changed something without ever mentioning it. Perhaps there was a perfectly reasonable explanation. Perhaps there was not. Either way, the decision had been made without me. That evening Victor seemed unusually attentive. He offered to grill steaks for dinner, asked whether I wanted to watch an old movie after we finished eating, and even complimented the flowers I had arranged in the dining room earlier that week. Anyone watching us from outside would have seen a comfortable retired couple enjoying another peaceful evening together. I smiled, laughed when appropriate, and thanked him for dinner. Inside, however, I found myself observing rather than participating. Every sentence sounded carefully measured. Every gesture felt slightly delayed, as though we were both performing familiar roles while standing farther apart than either of us wanted to acknowledge. Before going upstairs, Victor mentioned that he would be leaving early Saturday morning to help an old colleague with a property inspection nearly 2 hours away. I nodded and wished him safe travels. After he disappeared into the bedroom, I remained alone in the living room, staring at the reflection of the dark backyard in the window. Somewhere between the missing transfers, the redirected financial correspondence, and the growing collection of half-finished explanations, one truth had become impossible to ignore. Whatever Victor was protecting required planning that had begun long before the night everything changed, and if he had been quietly preparing for months, I knew I could no longer afford to remain one step behind. Saturday morning arrived with a pale gray sky, and the kind of cool breeze that always reminded me summer had finally surrendered to autumn. Victor left just after 7 o'clock carrying a travel mug of coffee, and repeating the same explanation he had given me the night before. He said his former coworker needed help inspecting a rental property before putting it on the market. I smiled, wished him a safe drive, and watched his car disappear down the street. I waited another 15 minutes before leaving the house myself, not because I intended to follow him, but because I had already decided my search for answers would begin somewhere entirely different. I drove across town to meet Grace for breakfast at the little diner where the waitresses still knew our names and remembered exactly how we liked our coffee. Grace greeted me with a warm smile, but she immediately noticed the stack of neatly organized folders resting inside my tote bag. I admitted that I had been reviewing our financial records, and that several details no longer made sense. I still avoided making accusations because I wanted facts instead of assumptions. Grace listened quietly, stirring her coffee without interrupting. When I finished speaking, she rested both hands around her mug and took a slow breath before saying something that changed the direction of my thinking. She told me she had recently volunteered at a fundraising event hosted by the local historical society. While helping guests sign in, she noticed Victor arrive with a professionally dressed woman she had never met before. Grace emphasized that nothing about their behavior appeared inappropriate. They simply looked comfortable together, like two people working toward the same purpose. What caught her attention was not their conversation but the paperwork they carried. She remembered seeing folders marked with the logo of a financial consulting company, because she had recently hired the same firm to review her retirement portfolio. Victor had never mentioned meeting with financial consultants. He had certainly never mentioned attending community events related to investments. Grace apologized if the information created unnecessary worry, but she believed I deserved to know what she had seen. I thanked her sincerely because she had given me something far more valuable than speculation. She had given me another piece of a puzzle built from ordinary facts. After breakfast, I drove home without turning on the radio. The quiet inside the car gave me space to connect everything I had learned during the previous week. The redirected correspondence, the unexplained transfers, the expensive clothing receipt, the repeated absences. Now there was also a financial consulting firm that had somehow entered Victor's schedule, without ever entering our conversations. By the time I reached the driveway, my confusion had slowly transformed into determination. I carried the folders back into my study and began creating a simple timeline, writing down dates, transactions, conversations, and every unusual event I could remember. Looking at the pages spread across my desk, I noticed something remarkable. The changes had not begun recently. They stretched back almost 18 months, each one so small that I had dismissed it at the time. Together they formed a careful pattern that no longer looked accidental. Late that afternoon, Victor returned home appearing relaxed and satisfied. He placed a small bakery box on the kitchen counter and cheerfully announced that he had brought fresh apple turnovers because he knew they were my favorite this time of year. I thanked him warmly and placed them onto a serving plate beside 2 cups of coffee. We sat together at the kitchen table discussing neighborhood news, weekend football, and the changing leaves outside the window. He spoke with the confidence of someone convinced his carefully arranged world remained perfectly intact. I listened just as calmly, knowing that while he believed he was protecting a secret, the truth had already begun revealing itself one quiet detail at a time. Monday morning began with an unusual sense of clarity. For the first time in weeks, I no longer felt driven by fear or confusion. I had enough pieces to understand that something significant had been unfolding behind the ordinary routine of our retirement, but I also understood that guessing would only lead me in the wrong direction. Facts would always matter more than suspicion. After Victor left the house, I picked up the telephone and called Benjamin Hayes, the attorney who had helped us update our estate planning several years earlier. He remembered me immediately and offered to meet later that afternoon. I did not tell Victor where I was going. I simply said I planned to spend a few hours running errands, which was completely true. Benjamin welcomed me into his office with the same calm professionalism I had always appreciated. I explained that I wanted to review my own legal and financial position without making changes or creating unnecessary conflict. I carefully avoided making accusations because I still lacked complete information. Instead, I asked practical questions. What documents should I personally have access to? What records should I keep? What rights did I have concerning jointly owned assets? Benjamin answered each question patiently, encouraging me to gather copies of every financial record available to me, and to keep detailed notes of anything that appeared unusual. He reminded me that preparation was never the same as confrontation. Leaving his office, I felt lighter than I had in days. For the first time, I realized I was no longer reacting to circumstances. I was preparing for whatever truth eventually emerged. Back at home, I settled into an entirely new routine without changing anything Victor could easily notice. I continued cooking our meals, watering the flowers on the front porch, folding laundry, and watching our favorite evening television programs beside him. If anything, I became even calmer than before. Victor seemed relieved by my quiet acceptance. His shoulders gradually relaxed. He laughed more often during dinner. Occasionally he even reached across the table to compliment a recipe or thank me for making dessert. Watching him become more comfortable was strangely revealing. The more convinced he became that I had stopped paying attention, the less carefully he guarded his habits. One evening he left his jacket hanging over the back of a dining room chair instead of carrying it upstairs. While moving it to the hallway closet before bedtime, I noticed several folded business cards tucked inside one of the pockets. They belonged to a financial advisory firm located nearly 70 miles away. The same company Grace had mentioned after the Historical Society fundraiser. I read only the information printed on the cards before placing them back exactly where I had found them. There was no satisfaction in discovering another clue, only quiet confirmation that the pattern continued exactly as I had begun to suspect. During the following week, Victor made 2 more unexplained trips, each accompanied by simple explanations that sounded increasingly rehearsed. I responded with the same gentle smile every time. I never questioned his schedule. I never challenged his stories. Instead, I returned to my study each evening and added another date, another observation, another small detail to the timeline spread neatly across my desk. Looking at those pages had become almost comforting because they reminded me that truth rarely arrived through dramatic moments. It revealed itself patiently, one ordinary fact beside another. By the end of the week, I realized something even more important than any receipt, bank statement, or business card. Victor had become completely convinced that I trusted every word he said. He believed my silence meant surrender. He believed my kindness meant ignorance. He believed the careful life he had arranged remained entirely under his control. Sitting alone beside the softly glowing desk lamp that Friday night, I closed the final folder and quietly smiled to myself. He had no idea that while he was protecting his version of the story, I was steadily preparing for the day when every missing piece would finally fit together. The following Tuesday brought the first unexpected breakthrough, and it arrived so quietly that I almost overlooked it. I had stopped by the mailbox after returning from the grocery store, and noticed a plain white envelope mixed in with the usual advertisements and utility statements. It was addressed to Victor, but unlike most of the financial correspondence I had seen recently, this one had been delivered to our home instead of whatever alternate mailing preference had been arranged. I placed the stack on the kitchen counter and continued putting away groceries. Nearly an hour later, Victor called to say he would be home later than expected, because an old friend wanted to have dinner, and discuss a business opportunity. His voice sounded relaxed, almost rehearsed. After we ended the call, I looked at the unopened envelope again. It had no confidential markings, only the return address of the same financial advisory firm, whose business cards I had quietly returned to his jacket days earlier. I did not open it. Instead, I simply made a note of the date and placed the envelope exactly where he would expect to find it. When Victor arrived that evening, he noticed the mail immediately. For the first time in weeks, I saw genuine surprise cross his face. He picked up the envelope almost too quickly, smiled at me, and casually mentioned that it contained routine retirement information. He slipped it into his briefcase before sitting down for dinner. His explanation lasted only a few seconds, but his reaction stayed with me much longer. If the contents were truly routine, there would have been no reason to remove them from the kitchen before finishing his meal. The following morning I called Benjamin Hayes again and scheduled another appointment. This time I brought organized copies of every financial statement, my handwritten timeline, and notes documenting each unexplained transfer and unusual change I had observed over the previous 18 months. Benjamin studied everything carefully without interrupting. When he finally looked up, his expression remained calm. He explained that none of the individual events necessarily proved wrongdoing, but together they suggested that important financial decisions had been made without the transparency that had previously existed in our marriage. He encouraged me to continue documenting facts rather than drawing conclusions, and advised me to obtain updated copies of publicly available property and business records if they became relevant. His measured response strengthened my confidence because it reminded me that patience remained my greatest advantage. Returning home, I placed every document back into its folder with even greater care than before. My study no longer felt like a place where I stored paperwork. It had quietly become the one room in the house where uncertainty slowly transformed into understanding. That evening Victor suggested we spend the weekend visiting a nearby lakeside town, saying it would be good for both of us to get away for a couple of days before winter arrived. Months earlier I would have accepted immediately, grateful for the chance to reconnect. This time I smiled warmly and agreed without hesitation, but inside I wondered why he had suddenly become so eager to create pleasant memories after months of emotional distance. The invitation felt less like affection and more like careful timing. Later that night, after Victor had gone upstairs, I returned to my desk and reviewed the timeline once again. One date caught my attention. Nearly every unexplained transfer, every unexpected trip, and every unusual meeting had occurred within days of one another, almost as though they followed a carefully planned schedule. Looking at those repeating patterns, I realized I was no longer searching through random moments. I was looking at a deliberate sequence of decisions. Whatever Victor had been building had required consistency, preparation, and confidence that I would never notice. As I gently closed the final folder and turned off the lamp, I understood that I was closer than ever to the truth, and for the first time since this quiet journey had begun, I believed the next missing piece would not come from another receipt or another bank statement. It would come from a choice Victor believed was completely safe to make. The weekend trip arrived with bright skies and unusually warm temperatures for late October. Victor seemed almost cheerful as he loaded our overnight bags into the trunk before sunrise. During the drive he pointed out colorful hillsides, joked about old road trips we had taken with friends decades earlier, and even reached across the center console to gently squeeze my hand. Anyone watching us stop for coffee along the highway would have believed they were looking at a happily retired couple, enjoying another peaceful autumn getaway. I smiled back just enough to keep everything feeling natural. By then I had learned that appearances often revealed very little. We checked into a quiet lakeside and shortly before noon. It overlooked calm water surrounded by trees whose leaves reflected shades of crimson, gold, and deep orange across the shoreline. Victor suggested we walk along the marina before dinner, saying he had always wanted to spend more time there after retirement. As we strolled beside the docks, I noticed how often he glanced toward his phone whenever it vibrated inside his jacket pocket. He never answered while I stood beside him, but he always found a reason to pause a few steps behind or linger near a bench before quietly reading whatever had appeared on the screen. Late that afternoon he excused himself, explaining that one of his former coworkers needed to ask him a quick question about an investment property. He insisted the call would only take a few minutes and walked toward the hotel lobby. I remained outside overlooking the lake, watching small boats drift peacefully across the water. Nearly 20 minutes passed before he returned. His expression was composed, but something about his pace felt different. He had the look of someone relieved that an important conversation had ended successfully. That evening we shared dinner in the inn's dining room. The conversation stayed comfortably light. We discussed travel plans we had once dreamed about, our grandchildren living several states away, and whether we should finally replace the aging fence around our backyard next spring. Listening to him speak so naturally made me realize how easily ordinary conversations could exist beside carefully hidden truths. After dinner, Victor announced that he wanted to stop by the business center downstairs to print directions for our drive home the next morning, because cellular service around the lake had been unreliable. I told him I would head upstairs and read for a while before bed. Nearly 40 minutes later, I stepped into the hallway intending to refill my water bottle from the ice machine. As I passed the small business center near the elevators, I noticed the lights were still on. Through the open doorway, I caught a brief glimpse of Victor standing beside the printer with another professionally dressed woman. They were reviewing several pages together, quietly pointing to different sections before placing the documents into matching folders. There was no dramatic confrontation, no raised voices, and no behavior that appeared personally affectionate. They simply looked like two people finalizing important business. Before either of them noticed me, I continued walking without slowing my pace. Back inside our room, I sat beside the window overlooking the dark lake and allowed myself to absorb what I had just seen. Grace had been right. The financial advisory firm had never been a coincidence. Victor had not been attending random meetings or harmless errands. Whatever he had been arranging involved careful planning, organized paperwork, and people I had never once heard him mention. When he returned to the room several minutes later carrying a folded map and smiling as though nothing unusual had happened, I looked up from my book, wished him good night, and switched off the bedside lamp. In the darkness, I no longer wondered whether something important had been hidden from me. I knew it had. The only question remaining was exactly how much of our future had already been decided without my knowledge, and I quietly promised myself that before anyone else revealed their plans, I would uncover every remaining page of the story for myself. When we returned home on Sunday afternoon, the house felt exactly as we had left it, yet I no longer saw it as the place where our future would quietly unfold. Instead, it had become the place where every unanswered question would finally receive an answer. Early Monday morning, after Victor left for another one of his carefully explained appointments, I drove directly to Benjamin Hayes's office carrying the complete collection of folders I had assembled over the previous several weeks. Every bank statement, every handwritten note, every unusual transaction, every receipt, and every date rested neatly inside a single leather portfolio. Benjamin reviewed everything slowly, occasionally asking me simple questions about dates or conversations. When he finished, he leaned back in his chair and spoke with the same calm tone he had maintained from the beginning. He explained that while many of the financial activities themselves appeared lawful, the consistent lack of transparency regarding jointly planned retirement decisions could have significant consequences if major assets had been redirected or restructured without meaningful discussion. More importantly, he reminded me that knowledge gave me choices, and choices gave me control. He encouraged me to request complete financial disclosures through the proper legal channels before making any irreversible decisions. Walking back to my car, I realized something had quietly changed inside me. I was no longer trying to save the version of my marriage that had existed years earlier. I was simply protecting the future I had spent a lifetime helping to build. During the following week, Victor announced that we needed to meet with financial advisors to discuss several long-term retirement strategies. He spoke confidently, almost enthusiastically, as though presenting an exciting opportunity we would explore together. I smiled and agreed without hesitation. The appointment was scheduled for Friday morning. When we entered the conference room, I immediately recognized the same professional woman I had briefly seen beside him at the Lakeside Inn. She greeted me politely, clearly surprised that I had accompanied Victor. Several folders already rested on the polished conference table. Victor began explaining that he had been exploring options designed to simplify our finances and make future estate planning easier for everyone. He spoke smoothly, carefully choosing reassuring words. Then he slid a packet of documents toward me, and politely suggested that I sign several authorization forms so everything could move forward efficiently. I looked down at the paperwork but made no effort to pick up the pen waiting beside it. Instead, I quietly removed my own folder from my handbag and placed it on the table. Inside were organized copies of every financial record I had gathered, a detailed timeline covering the previous 18 months, and a letter prepared by Benjamin Hayes requesting complete documentation of every account, transfer, advisory agreement, and investment decision made during that period. The room became noticeably quieter. The financial advisor slowly lowered her hands. Victor looked at the folder before looking back at me, and for the first time in many months his confident smile disappeared. He asked softly where I had obtained all of those records. I met his eyes with the same calm expression I had carried since the night everything began. I told him that trust had once allowed me to stop asking questions, but silence had taught me to start paying attention. I explained that I was not there to accuse anyone or create a scene. I was simply there to ensure that every decision affecting my future would finally be made with honesty and complete transparency. No one spoke for several long moments. Eventually, the advisor suggested postponing the meeting until every document could be properly reviewed. I stood, thanked her for her professionalism, gathered my folder and walked toward the door. Victor quietly called my name, but I paused only long enough to look back at him. Months earlier he had told me that he did not owe me an explanation. Standing there, I realized I no longer needed one. The truth had revealed itself through patience, careful observation, and quiet preparation. I left the building with something far more valuable than answers. I left knowing that my future would never again depend upon promises made in silence.